Okay, welcome everybody, and a particular warm welcome to John's mum and dad, John and Kate, and to John's wife Jill and his daughter Jess. And I'm aware that some of his guests here today include former PhD students and former colleagues. So welcome everybody. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathon Shears. Jonathon's main research areas are 19th century literature. He is a world-leading expert on Romanticism, and he brings a history of emotion and aging studies to major literary texts. Jonathon's main interest is in poetic influence, specifically the work of Lord Byron, material culture, aging and intergenerational studies, and alco literary traditions, as the picture explains. He studied at the University of Oxford, his BA in 1995 to 1998, postgraduate work including a PhD at the University of Liverpool from 1998 to 2004. I believe he gave up a very promising career as a DJ to become an academic. And so his academic career began with lectureships at the University of Chester, then Aberystwyth, and he was finally appointed to his dream job at Keele as a lecturer in 19th century literature in 2009. During his magnificent career here at Keele, he has published 7 books and dozens of articles and chapters. His books include, and I'm going to read the list here, The Romantic Legacy of Paradise Lost, Reading, Writing and the Influence of Harold Bloom, Literary Bric-a-Brac and the Victorians, Byron's Temperament, Essays in Body and Mind, The Great Exhibition, a source book, The Hangover, a literary and cultural history, which John's going to talk about today, and then the Oxford Handbook of Lord Byron. From 2012 to 2019, John served as the editor of the Byron Journal and won the Elmer Dangerfield Prize for his book, Byron's Temperament. He sits on the executive committee of the Byron Society and has guest edited for the journals such as Romanticism and the Journal of the British Academy. In recent times, John has exhibited his age-themed research at the British Academy Summer Showcase and the Royal Society Summer Science Exhibition. He's going to talk to us today about some of the material from his last monograph, The Hangover, a literary and cultural history, which was published by Liverpool University Press. That's his formal academic research accomplishments. I've spoken to his head of school and some of his colleagues, and all of them speak very highly of John as a colleague, as an excellent educator. He teaches very widely and establishes great relationships with his students. His research-led teaching involves a very popular module, the alcohol question, which I believe has very interesting field trips. He mentors colleagues and his PGRs, and he's a very valued colleague. He works with a range of partners on intergenerational awareness, health humanities, and public engagement, which includes the Beth Johnson Foundation, Age UK, and the National Trust. Jonathon is a wonderful colleague, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy listening to his thoughts and his research on hangover in literature and culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. I'd forgotten I'd done all that. No one ever mentions the Cycling Proficiency Award, though. That's obviously important too. Right, I'm going to change glasses so I can see this properly. You know that sometimes before a big event, particularly public speaking, you'll have a nightmare about it, won't you? About something awful that has happened, something awful that is going to happen. We've all been there in that situation. Well, that didn't happen for me this time. Last night I had a dream that everything was brilliant. It went fantastically well. And I woke up with this huge wave of relief. And then I remembered, you've not done it yet. It's today. So, I mean, I'm hoping that dreams do come true sometimes. And it's a dream come true that you're all here today. Good to get your audience on side early, I think. So I know it's been difficult times recently for our faculty. And so I'm doubly kind of grateful that you've come today. I really am. While I'm talking about gratitude, a few people to thank. So I'd like to thank my family, Jill and Jess, particularly. I'd like to thank my PhD supervisor, Bernard Beattie at Liverpool, who really helped me turn things around, was a great inspiration to me. My parents, of course, who are here as well. And I'm blessed to work with intelligent and talented and generous and hugely attractive as well colleagues. And it's really great that you're able to be. I can't mention everybody by name, of course. I do want to just mention Nick Seeger, who I started out with here at Keele back in 2009. And I couldn't have asked for a more generous and supportive head of school, especially during the application procedure for promotion. Okay, so I just wanted to do that briefly now, because once I get into things, I know I'll find it difficult to sort of get out of them again. Okay, so let's start then. When choosing my topic, there were a few contenders, including Lord Byron. So Donna mentioned this and some of the other things that I do before. So could I really give an inaugural lecture about hangovers? Was this appropriate? Well, so when you've written a book on the topic, you kind of have to lean into it. And then there came a point where I couldn't delay any longer choosing what I was going to talk about. And at that point, something happened. And what happened was, my parents emptied their loft. And this will become kind of relevant in a moment. So one of the many things that they brought round to our house was my old matriculation photograph from my undergraduate days. So matriculation is where you officially join the university, so usually after about a week's time. And it's a big kind of ceremony, and everyone sort of dresses up, and there's a big photograph of the whole year group in the college gardens. So yeah, this photograph, I kind of remember this very misty, it was October morning, and there I am, dressed in subfusk, which is a dark suit with a white bow tie, slightly bleary-eyed, a feeble smile playing across my face, leaning over to one side. A young man who, shortly after that, would be very sick into his sink. So I'm not telling you that just to unburden myself, but I'm telling you because it struck me that after a fashion, my academic career started with a hangover. So it felt like someone was guiding me towards this topic as a subject, and I should embrace it. So there we go. So this is what you've signed up for. I was hoping that I was going to have hangover cocktail remedies outside there, but unfortunately the licensing agreement couldn't be worked out with catering. But I hope you're all feeling sufficiently braced anyway. And if anyone is feeling a little delicate, I know it's customary to offer content warnings these days about sensitive material in a talk. So this is just to warn you that this talk will contain images of Boris Johnson that some of you may find distressing. Okay, so everyone recognises somebody with a hangover. The man or woman, shaky, headachy, with bloodshot eyes, who would rather pull the duvet back over their head than face the world. It's a cliche. An image of loss of control due to alcoholic intoxication, although it has received next to no attention in literary drinking studies. Until now, that is. So perhaps it's neglected because when we first think of hangovers, we think of physical symptoms and remedies. There is a market for books that purport to offer a cure. But a cure for what exactly. So this genre of books will tell you that what is wrong is a nasty collection of physical symptoms. Common ones include headache, nausea, dehydration, trembling, and sickness. Now, science tells us that hangovers derive from the way the body metabolizes ethanol to create toxins such as acetaldehyde. And it's the breakdown of alcohol by the body rather than the alcohol itself that makes you feel ill. Alcohol is a vasodilator. And the severity of the hangover depends on the subsequent contraction of the blood vessels, so that's what causes headaches. And you'll know that alcohol is a diuretic. So that explains the dehydration. So lots of physical reasons to feel bad. But hangovers are equally about the personal and social reasons why we might feel bad. And I had to bring Byron in at the start, and this is where the title of my talk comes from. So this is from Byron's poem Don Juan, in which he pithily divides the hangover in two. So he says, "Few things surpass old wine, and they may preach you please, the more because they preach in vain. Let us have wine and women, mirth and laughter, sermons and soda water the day after." So sermons speak to the conscience, and soda water, which was Byron's preferred remedy, to the body. But Byron knew full well that the problems of identity raised by the hangover were more complex than this. So I'm going to spare you the dry academic business of how I think my book fits into literary drinking studies. You're here for some nice descriptions of hangovers. And as hangovers often plunge us in rather unmercifully, we'll start with this one from Tom Wolfe's The Bonfire of the Vanities. The telephone blasted Peter Fallow awake inside an egg with the shell peeled away and only the membranous sac holding it intact. Ah! The membranous sac was his head, and the right side of his head was on the pillow, and the yolk was as heavy as mercury, and it rolled like mercury, and it was pressing down on his right temple, and his right eye, and his right ear. If he tried to get up to answer the telephone, the yolk, the mercury, the poisoned mass would shift and roll and rupture the sac, and his brains would fall out. So it's a splendidly visceral sequence. Through free indirect discourse, we see the sufferer reaching out for a metaphor that might convey their confused senses. But the body is a vehicle to express a larger crisis of identity, which is confirmed when Fallow gets up and catches a glimpse of his beer belly in a mirror. Never again. He would begin an exercise regimen tonight, or tomorrow in any case. He felt too bilious to think about tonight. It wouldn't be this pathetic American business of jogging either. It would be something clean, crisp, brisk, strenuous, English. He thought of medicine balls and exercise ladders and leather horses and Indian clubs and pulley weights and parallel bars and stout ropes with leather bindings on the end. And then he realized that these were the apparatus of the gymnasium at Cross Keys, the school he had attended prior to the University of Kent. Dear God, 20 years ago. So Fallow's self-image depends on notions of English sophistication deriving from his schooling that are invoked as a counterbalance to the damage done by drink. Not only does the body suffer, but a larger sense of cultural identity. Now, the hangover is often associated with resolutions, pledges to abstain. In literature, perhaps the most famous example is from the start of Bridget Jones's diary. So we have this list of I will not, I will, drink more than 14 alcohol units a week, smoke, spend more than earn, allow in-trade to rage out of control, etc., etc. Of course, there are other ways in which Bridget Jones chooses to recover. At this moment where she thinks that she might be pregnant, if you've read the book, you might remember, she has this glorious hangover buffet. 2 packets Emmental cheese slices, 1 litre freshly squeezed orange juice, 1 cold potato, 2 pieces unbaked lemon cheesecake, very light, also possibly eating for 2, 1 Milky Way, 125 calories only, body's enthusiastic response to cheesecake suggested baby needed sugar, etc., etc. So pledges to abstain. Reappraisals. Then again, there may be good psychological reasons not to appraise oneself too closely. As John Cheever puts it, awake before dawn, feeling tired and full of resolutions. Do not drink, do not, etc., etc. So what attracted me to The Hangover was the way it combined triviality with the wholly serious. So, you might remember, do you remember Boris Johnson's moment of shame when he was coming back from Alexander's Lebedev's, one of his moments of shame? His Italian mansion. Yeah, you do then, okay. So, witnesses reported he was quite dishevelled and his trousers were twisted and creased. He looked like he'd slept in his clothes. How would you know it is any difference from normal? When he was walking out to the plane, he did this curved walk. I really thought he was going to be sick on the tarmac. So at the time, Johnson, of course, was Foreign Secretary and apparently had slipped his security detail. If Peter Fallow can't remember what happened and he suffers from blackouts, Johnson, of course, famously refused to and still refuses to say what happened. In his 1971 essay on The Hangover, Kingsley Amis complained that the media's obsession with remedies at times like New Year means they omit the psychological, moral, emotional, spiritual aspects, all that vast, vague, shimmering metaphysical superstructure of The Hangover. So that's the focus of my talk today. And you've had a few remedies already. I know most people want to know about remedies, so I'll give you another one just now. So Amis's preferred remedy apparently was what he called a Polish bison. So that was hot bovril mixed with vodka. Okay, so there is a surprisingly rich tradition of hangover literature in Western culture that has been largely ignored. And in my book, I argue that the textual constructions of The Hangover can play an important part in increasing our understanding of how attitudes to alcohol use develop and alter over time. They offer a way to understand the consciousness and the conscience of the drinker. And most of my examples are going to be what we might call habitual drinkers, sometimes they're self-identifying as alcoholics, although it's more common now to use expressions sort of chronic drinkers or problem drinkers. There will be a few examples of sort of occasional drinkers as well. So Wolfe tells us then that these days, Fallow often woke up like this, poisonously hungover, afraid to move an inch, and filled with an abstract feeling of despair and shame. So when Fallow cries out, "Ah!" it is both an expression of pain and of ironic sort of half recognition of what has happened that cannot be properly verbalized. It's what Anya Taylor calls the drinker's impression of an objectless dread, disturbing yet hard to unpack. So it's natural to want to overcome the physical symptoms of a hangover as quickly as possible, and Fallow drinks from a bottle of vodka. Now, the use of remedies has been labelled the withdrawal relief recovery method by the aptly named Sherry Span and Mitchell Early Wine. And I'm not making that up. In contrast to withdrawal relief, they call the Bridget Jones abstention model a traditional punishment response, whereby individuals who experience the punishing effects of hangover will reduce their drinking accordingly. But hangover literature indicates the latter involves much more than a decision to lay off the booze. It's a literature that addresses a broader human experience of regret, self-doubt, and a search for meaning, a byproduct of intoxication, but not intoxication, a unique route to self-knowledge, as Amis proposes. You might not know the word hangover actually enters the English language pretty late. It's not until 1904 that it's first applied to alcohol in a dictionary of American slang terms. So it's an American term originally. Under the definition brain, usually occupied by the intellect brothers' thoughts and ideas as an intelligence office, but sometimes sublet to Jag, Hangover, and Co. So that does not mean that there are no earlier documented hangovers, as we will see. A final word for literature before I really get going. Martin Amis in The Information suggests that literature has an affinity with hangovers. He posits that there are epic hangovers, chillers, thrillers, bodice rippers, and the tragicomic. But most importantly, every hangover is a whodunit. That is, every hangover involves a reconstruction of past events. And they may just be the events of the night before, or they could also include a longer personal and cultural past. Note again Fallow's words, "Dear God, 20 years ago." The use of the term traditional punishment response, traditional, suggests that the hangover has a history, a cultural and, in my case, textual history. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief flavour of that, and then I'm going to come back to some of these kind of questions about individual and cultural identity. And there's an argument of sorts, but also what I intend to do is just show you some nice bits from the book. So, looking back from 1904, the immediate context would be Victorian, of course, wouldn't it? It would be the temperance movement. But in my book, I argue that this inheritance goes back at least as far as the early 17th century, where strict forms of Protestantism emerge, and the hangover becomes particularly associated with sinfulness and repentance and remorse. I'm not saying it didn't do at all before that, but particularly during that period. So the biblical injunction to consume alcohol in moderation deploys the hangover as a spiritual deterrent, as in Proverbs. To whom is woe, to whom is sorrow, to whom strife, to whom is mourning, to whom wounds without cause, and to whom is the redness of the eyes. And the early 17th century saw a flurry of activity to control public drinking due to the increased number of pubs and taverns. And there was a corresponding flurry of sermons and moral tracts aiming to dissuade people from heavy alcohol consumption, warning about the evils of drinking. So we've got Thomas Young's England's Bane there, A Monster Late Found Out and Discovered by Richard Rawledge, and Health Sickness by William Prynne. In 1552, the crime of public drunkenness in England became punishable by being placed in the stocks or being pilloried, so shame and ridicule combined. And through the early modern period, particularly during Cromwell's Commonwealth, drunkards would be shamed by having to wear what was known as a drunkard's cloak. So they would have to walk around in this barrel and were humiliated for it. So shame, again. And it's not uncommon in the period for nonconformists to treat the hangover as a type of hell, and hell itself as a type of hangover. So this is from Richard Carpenter's anti-Catholic work, The Downfall of Antichrist, where he adopts a Dante-esque contrapasso approach to punishment. Being laid and his mouth stopped with dirt, the drunkard ceases to reel, till at last he shall reel body and soul into hell, where, notwithstanding all his former plenty and variety of drinks, he shall never be so gracious as to obtain a small drop of water to cool his tongue. So the drunkard's hell is an eternity of dehydration. Now, there are other reasons then adjacent to sinfulness why drinkers might feel bad the morning after during the early modern period. The phenomenon of the curtain lecture, where wives upbraid dissolute husbands in bed for their misdemeanours, had an ante-meridian hangover variety. So this is from a 1639 book. What, not a word this morning? Cannot you speak, or have you lost your tongue? You may be ashamed, had you any grace in you at all, to be such a common drunkard, a pisspot, a beast, nay, worse than a beast, for they can tell when they've had sufficient, but thou canst not tell. Every day foxed, and at night brought home by a watchman. And the next morning you are then a little crop sick, and then to cure your squeezy stomach you get a hare with the same dog. As I am a sinner, I am ashamed of thee. Thou art such a noted tavern hunter. So the hair of the dog provides a refuge for the embattled husband in the example, such as this. Now, crop sickness was a common word for hangover in the early modern period. And the expression derives from the crop or gullet of a bird, so in birds such as doves and rooks, and the way they feed their young, with half-digested chyle or corn macerated, puking it from the crop into their mouth, as it is colourfully recorded by Walter Charlton in Enquiries into Human Nature from 1680. This is a hangover about power dynamics within the home. Now, in the Victorian period, Janet Dempster in George Eliot's Janet's Repentance tells us of a different domestic power dynamic. Because she's unable to reproach her abusive, though popular, husband, Janet drowns her sorrows. While Robert Dempster's good head for drink is legendary, Janet's hangovers mean she neglects housework, charity work, and loses her good reputation. Eliot explores how the nature of her shame contributes to Janet's chronic drunkenness, but she shows that she's held to a different set of standards than her husband, what Alison Rolfe calls the stigmatizing subject position of women drinkers. The shamed Janet is, however, as the title would suggest, able to repent and reform, whereas her husband, Robert, falls ill of delirium tremens and dies, often a common fate for male drunkards in the Victorian novel. So the domestic. Laziness, idleness was also a major cause of concern in the early modern period. And the student, yes, the student, was a particular focus of shame, I'm afraid. And perhaps the most famous student in literature is Hamlet. Did he ever suffer from particularly bad hangovers? Shakespeare doesn't make clear, but at the end of the 18th century, this parody of the to be or not to be soliloquy suggests possibilities. To drink or not to drink, that is the question. Whether 'tis better with good heart to bear the rage and torment of dry, parching thirst, or take large draughts and cure the gasping evil, and ease the panting gullet. To drink, to sit at ease, and with white polished tube to whiff and spurn all melancholy, and the greater ills that thirst is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To drink, perchance be drunk, aye, there's the rub, for in that state of insensibility, what hazards do we run when we have shuffled off our reason must give us pause. And yet in most respects, society and sobriety embitters life. For who would bear the taunts and jeers of sots, the topers' spurns, the bacchanals' contumely, the landlord's disdain, the scoffs and sneers we are doomed to take from saucy and impertinent waiters, when he himself might quaff the luscious bowl of wine, punch, and revel in mundingeon clouds of his own raising by aid of silken purse. But the dread of something after drinking hard, that crop-sick plague from which no toper's free, but by being drunk again puzzles the brain, and makes us rather choose to live soberly than run to drunken, mad, mischievous broils. Okay. So, in these contexts, the appropriate response to overindulgence is to feel remorse and seek forgiveness, which involves reconnecting with or acquiescing to acceptable standards of behaviour, what Emile Durkheim called sacred values. That's the essence of the traditional punishment response. Now, these sacred values might change. Peter Fallow's and Janet Dempster's are typical of their period. But they're always observable in some form, and there are continuities across this textual history. However, as Byron puts it, those who preach may preach in vain. So, in Aphraben's The Debauchee, for example, the long-suffering butler to the rakish Sir Oliver Thrivewell observes the behaviour of his social betters. Mercy upon us, what lives they lead. Never rise till 3 o'clock afternoon, or very rarely, and then they are damnable, dry and crop-sick, but not at all hungry, and so they lose both breakfast and dinner. Instead of prayers, the first words they speak as soon as awake are, "Damn me, how cursed drunk was I last night. Hey, Jack, some small beer, you vermin." You've waited quite a long time for another remedy, so we'll have another one now. So small beer, then, was a very weak ale. It was typically about 1%. Brewed at home and drunk at home by all classes. On the left-hand side there, you've got George Washington's recipe for small beer from his notebook that's in the New York Public Library. It was not an example of hair of the dog, even though I guess it kind of is alcohol. It was more about kind of rehydration, refreshment. So such figures as this, though, usually fueled by more alcohol, declare their independence by ignoring the checks and balances of the hangover. They are irredeemable in a biblical sense. The subject of the warning from Proverbs, "And thou shalt be as one that sleepeth in the midst of the sea, and as he that sleepeth in the top of the mast. They have stricken me, shalt thou say, but I was not sick. They have beaten me, but I knew not when I awoke, therefore will I seek it yet still." Now, there are plenty of other aspects to the cultural history of the hangover that I could go into, but the penitential mode dominates in Western literature and culture. When I'm talking about Western, I'm talking mainly about kind of English and American literature in my book. But they form then a set of cultural and textual archetypes that underline the hangover is as much a response to social cultural values as to the consumption of alcohol. Now, as we then move through the 19th into the 20th century, literature becomes more interested in preserving what Thomas Gilmore calls the complex humanity of the drunkard. And the penitential hangover response, I think, plays a big part in this. It's a sort of intersection between the sort of sympathetic language that's emerging in relation to addiction from medical documentation and then the condemnatory language of temperance era literature. Now, in the case of a conscientious paragon like Jude Fawley and Jude the Obscure, we find a sort of traditional punishment reaction, a typical one. So you might remember, he sacrilegiously recites the Nicene Creed in a pub in Christminster. The next day, he walks the punishing 20 miles home the next morning to his home of Mary Green. So the body becomes a sort of site of punishment, of self-flagellation. Jude reached the ancient hamlet while the people were at breakfast. Weary and mud-bespattered, but quite possessed of his ordinary clearness of brain, he sat down by the well, thinking as he did so, what a poor Christ he made. So Hardy makes it clear that this is really a journey not across country, but back in time, back to the values of his youth, a time before the frustrations of academic ambition intruded. Hardy uses the hangover to introduce the idea of a purpose that is found only by losing the way first. Yo Lingbar argues that deep investment in the perceived benefits of punishment can be strong enough that people may sometimes inflict pain on themselves in order to balance their misdeeds. In other words, the sufferer develops their own punitive mechanisms or constructs their own metaphorical pillory. We might say this also rings true of Peter Fallow's fantasy of public school athletic discipline. As Al Young puts it in his poem Hangover, drunkenness, the preferred pain of the Western world, might be crime and punishment both. But hangover literature suggests that shame-proneness and high levels of moral awareness may lead to different outcomes. And sometimes it demonstrates that the hangover problematizes even as it generates the conditions for the individual's confession of their misdeeds. Let's take an example of one of Robert Burns's many hangover letters. I'm not going to do a Scottish accent. Can ye minister to a mind diseased? Can ye, amid the horrors of penitence, regret, remorse, headache, nausea, and all the rest of the damned hounds of hell that beset a poor wretch who has been guilty of the sin of drunkenness, can you speak peace to a troubled soul? Here must I sit, a monument of the vengeance laid up in store for the wicked, slowly counting every click of the clock as it slowly, slowly numbers over these lazy scoundrels of ours, who, damn them, are ranked up before me, every one at his neighbour's backside, and every one with a burden of anguish on his back to pour on my devoted head. And there is none to pity me. My wife scolds me, my business torments me, and my sins come staring me in the face, every one telling a more bitter tale than his fellow. So if the conscience prompts the self to make amends for wrongdoing in our traditional sense, there is a playful self-awareness in Burns' earnestness. It's an example of what we might call penitence rhetoric. Now, Burns' contemporary Charles Lamb is an important figure in the cultural history of the hangover because he wrote a very important book called Confessions of the Drunkard in 1813. But we also find some great hangover apologies in his letters. So after a typical night of drunken indiscretion at the house of the Reverend Henry Carey, Lamb gives us a wonderful comic rendition of repentance. I protest, I know not in what words to invest my sense of the shameful violation of hospitality which I was guilty of on that fatal Wednesday. Let it be blotted from the calendar. Had it been committed at a layman's house, say a merchant's or manufacturer's, a cheesemonger's or greengrocer's, or to go higher, a barrister's, a member of parliament's, a rich banker's, I should have felt alleviation, a drop of self-pity. But to be seen deliberately to go out of the house of a clergyman drunk, a clergyman of the Church of England too. So Lamb regains status through mocking the idea of contrition, playing the part of a penitent, but playing it beautifully, mixing feelings of great humiliation with jokiness. But as in the case of Burns, this is self-consciously about penitence as a subject. Confessions of a Drunkard is a really important work. I'm not going to quote from it, but it's the first one to really introduce the idea of the sort of the torments that the alcoholic is personally experiencing, but also the idea of a kind of evasiveness and slipperiness to the alcoholic who cannot sort of help themselves. That becomes a theme then in 20th century drinking literature, where defiance of so-called sacred values is the dominant mood, really. So we shift attention to the figure of the romantic, drunken outsider, the existential drinker, who contests authority wherever they find it. This includes the modern girls of the 1920s and 30s, such as Sasha Jansen in Jean Rhys's Good Morning Midnight, Hemingway's Brett Ashley in The Sun Also Rises, and Christopher Isherwood's Sally Bowles in Goodbye to Berlin. Then the angry young men of the 1950s, Arthur Seaton in Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, the rebels without a cause of Charles Bukowski's novels, and ladettes and post-ladettes, such as Fielding's Bridget Jones and Hannah Luckraft in A.L. Kennedy's Paradise. And my students have studied some of these texts with me this semester. The hangovers of these characters are, however, some of the most crippling in literature, expressing angst and alienation. But the hangover is also a crucial component in representing the kind of social factors that complicate the assertion of an authentic outsider identity. And at this point, I just want to note the more general meaning of the word hangover, which is a thing or person remaining or left over, a remainder or survival, an after effect. And that's first noted by the OED in 1894, so only 10 years before the expression is applied to alcohol. So hangover is a new word, as it were, at the start of the 20th century, that through its etymology indicates something left over from and an uncertain connection to past times, suggesting perhaps a transition to modernity that can't quite shake off the values of an earlier age. That's an issue that I don't think the word hangover brings into being, but I think it makes it more visible and brings it into view. And I think it is a greater component of the subject once we reach the 20th century. So that's why I raise it there. So in this literature, the punishment of the hangover first represents a retaliation of social forces. So Arthur Seaton womanizes, he binges, but a fry-up the next day is enough to set him right. In Bukowski's novel Post Office, his hero, Henry Chinaski, goes further in enduring a sort of daily hangover ritual as a mailman. And I think Bukowski's language purposefully travesties the idea of a traditional punishment response. He says, "The whiskey and beer ran out of me, fountained from my armpits, and I drove along with this load on my back like a cross, puffing out magazines, delivering thousands of letters, staggering, welded to the side of the Sun." So we all have a cross to bear, that kind of thing. Now, in the case of then Sally Bowles, who's the quintessential sort of shameless modern girl, the hangover does not diminish her captivating eccentricity. Curled up on the sofa in the big dingy room, she smoked, drank prairie oysters, talked endlessly of the future. Time for another remedy. So the prairie oyster was part of a cluster of cocktails that was invented as hangover remedies in the 1930s, along with the Bloody Mary. I didn't get to serve Bloody Marys, but you'll be glad I didn't serve you these. So it consists of a raw egg yolk in brandy with Worcestershire sauce and then Tabasco sauce or cayenne pepper, that kind of thing. So it's very much part of what Michael Green, in The Art of Coarse Drinking, calls the hangover cure nauseous. Now, it is when the hangover infiltrates and exposes the vulnerabilities of an identity built on heavy drinking that the likes of Sillitoe, Isherwood, Bukowski depict ideas that are associated with this traditional punishment reflex that I've been talking about. So Seaton's beaten up by a squaddy. He then has a mammoth hangover, and that's what leads to the turning point into kind of, Sunday morning. Henry Chinaski in Bukowski's work, let me go back to that slide. Bukowski explores shame when Chinaski's father pushes his face into his vomit and he's been sick on a family expensive rug. But Chinaski starts to erect his own pillories. So he says, when he's slacking at a warehouse job, a man with a hangover should never lay flat on his back looking up at the roof of the warehouse. The wooden girders finally get to you, and the skylights. You can see the chicken wire in the glass skylights. That wire somehow reminds a man of jail. Now, hangover severity is often thought to be different for men and women due to things like sort of metabolism and body mass, but that underplays the sociocultural factors that Isherwood is interested in. So Sally Bowles' shamelessness is mixed with a vulnerability that increases as her drinking problem worsens. When Sally gets pregnant and has a termination, she imagines what it would have been like to be a mother. Do you know, I sat here for a long time by myself and held this cushion in my arms and imagined it was my baby. So Sally's performing her own shaming ritual. She acknowledges it's like finding out all the old rules are true after all, and then only semi-ironically wonders, do you think I could become a nun, Chris? So it's not necessarily the case of being nursed on the supernatural as Jude the Obscure, but hangovers host a crisis of identity for these characters. Was that metaphysical superstructure comes back in sort of unexpected and unwelcome ways. But the superstructure is also vague and shimmering, as Amos suggested. I'm just going to read a couple of poems now where I think this comes through. So this is from Charles Bukowski's Hangover and Sick Leave. I know very little, and while I have eyes inside my head and feet to walk with, and there are universities and books full of men and places like Rome and Madrid, I stay in bed and watch the light rise in the curtains and listen to the sounds that I dislike, and I fear the angry wife, the landlord, the psychiatrist, the police, the priest. Yet in bed here, the sun and myself, working around my bones, I am real enough. So Bukowski turns this experience into almost a kind of a comforting embrace. I think the key to the poem is that first line, I know very little. It's a pun on ignorance, but also memory loss too, common feature of the hangover. So if the self-consciously modern drinker that I was just talking about attempts to face down the hangover in ways that recall the book of Proverbs, but I knew not when I awoke, therefore will I seek it yet still. Perhaps we're also drawing attention to that first bit there that I've underlined, but I knew not when I awoke. I know very little. So I'm not suggesting that Bukowski is directly alluding to this, but Elizabeth Bishop certainly is in her poem, The Unbeliever. This is just the end of the poem. He sleeps on the top of his mast with his eyes closed tight. The gull inquired into his dream, which was, I must not fall. The spangled sea below wants me to fall. It's as hard as diamonds. It wants to destroy us all. So Bishop's imagery is notoriously cryptic. What's going on here is rather than face a moral lesson with eyes closed tight, the drinker remains asleep. But unbeliever means less an absence of faith than an unwillingness to face up to his problems in the poem. Now, memory loss then. It evokes that Martin Amis whodunit hangover. And there is a strain of literature in crime fiction where the plot turns on the fact the drinker can't remember what happened the night before. But the memory loss that Bukowski and Bishop are talking about suggests something more metaphysical, I think. And that leads me into my final thoughts about the way the traditional punishment hangover plays out in literary history. It takes us back into that territory of Peter Fallow's abstract feeling of despair, or what Robert Burns calls a miserable blank in my heart, something nebulous that is left over, to employ the essence of the word hangover again, when other factors seem to have been explained away. Now, the invitation to consider this in terms of that I've been discussing comes in Charles Jackson's famous study of the alcoholic, The Lost Weekend, where Don Burnham reflects on his drinking problem. You lived always in a state of mortal apprehension, of some dreadful deed committed for which, though you were called to account, you could never bear witness. So that judicial vocabulary is crucial. But Jackson's territory has subtly shifted. It shifted from the refusal to the inability to testify to the crimes that might lead to salvation or a more secular brand of reparation. Being unable to wholly bear witness is a kind of Kafkaesque notion. It comes through in Raymond Chandler's book, The Long Goodbye, as well, where the blackout drunkard Roger Wade, he thinks he's murdered someone. He can't remember what has happened the night before. But the hard-boiled detective Philip Marlowe proves a more effective reader of human character than the psychologist that Wade visits. He says, he thinks he has a secret buried in his mind and he can't get at it. It may be a guilty secret about himself. It may be about someone else. He thinks that's what makes him drink because he can't get at this thing. Wade's problems can't be admitted, or really they can't be articulated. They are the equivalent of Peter Fallow's exclamation, "Ah, wholly significant and yet wholly inscrutable." The idea that part of himself is missing due to memory loss, the part that should be brought to account, is the existential drinker's most shattering discovery, but also perhaps their last resort of resistance to sacred values. This is something that A.L. Kennedy presents in more postmodern fashion in her 2004 novel Paradise. We get an anti-heroine, Hannah Lookcraft, who's a post-ladette, and she drinks to avoid being absorbed into traditional feminine roles. And Hannah is a character whose behaviour, she shows a sort of willful disregard for her mental and her physical well-being. She's sexually promiscuous. She's flying in the face of all sorts of kind of correct values that her parents represent. However, she does say at one point that I do feel remorse for every sin. Inside, I'm mostly built out of remorse. Traditional punishment again. But now this, we're moving into kind of like the sort of postmodern here to finish, really. So she says, in a kind of jaunty fashion, about her blackouts, because once you've begun to have blackouts, you'll never stop. And so before and after don't exist. You've mastered the art of escaping from linear time. The jumps and jolts take a bit of getting used to. Driving is particularly tricky, guessing what gear you're in or if you're trying to overtake. But this keeps you bright and springy, alert, and there is nothing unnatural about it, nothing dreadful. Some level of blacking out is what lets people survive. So this novel sets out the drinker's warped logic that equates conventional human behaviour with the self-destructive drive towards alcoholism. Most importantly, it proposes that the self that cannot be narrated is the self that cannot be judged. Something indecipherable is left over, a hangover, an impulse towards punishment so strong that it is self-destructive. So she embraces this as a kind of form of functional amnesia, separating herself from the events of the night before, but arguably, theoretically, from the links that bind her to the conventional narrative of crime and punishment that I've been exploring. To conclude then, ultimately Hannah's claim to have escaped linear time is one utterance amongst many others that suggest the contrary. There always exists the threat that the unaccounted or unaccountable elements of the self that allegedly allow the postmodern drinker to cheat time and with its social reprisals may only be temporarily missing. Even so, Kennedy's largely first-person narration means that there are no objective criteria from which to judge Hannah Lookcraft. So Hannah finds that the underlying reasons she feels so bad resist articulation. Although if her paradise is intoxication without judgment, Kennedy hints that the wish is father of the thought. Nevertheless, Paradise reminds us of an essential factor in the larger history of the textual constructions of drunkenness, which is that the hangover may be less a question of who done it than the more existential who am I? Thank you for listening.